Morning, everyone. Great to see you all. My name's Alan Gregg. I'm with the Challenging Male Supremacy Project in New York City. And it's a real pleasure to be here this morning and to be present at the whole symposium. I was at the Rio conference 5 years ago, and it's wonderful to see how the work is growing and more people coming into it, and the way the conversation, I think, is deepening. And we want to deepen the conversation further this morning about what this work engaging men and boys actually means in relation to the material conditions that Kate Gilmore described yesterday that we're engaging with. So she set us up really nicely for this plenary this morning in terms of the focus of what we'll be talking about. And I'm really delighted to be sharing the platform with such a distinguished panel of deviants.
Thank you.
So we have Dina Siddiqui, Nivedita Menon, Benedict Kaiser, and Quentin Walcott. They will all introduce themselves to you when they present, and we're going to take it, each person will present for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation on the stage and with you all about what we've been discussing. I think when Kate described the importance of dissent and disruptive discourse, I think that's really important. The urgency that she talked about to me is an urgency about shaking things up. We can't continue with the status quo. We need to shake things up, and I'm hoping this panel will contribute to that. And I'm seeing this panel as a way to explore what these material conditions actually look like in particular places at particular times with particular communities. So although the conversation we'll be in might sound at times quite big and overwhelming, we're encouraging, and the speakers will be focusing on the specifics of material conditions in particular places, whether it's Mexico, New York City, towns and villages in India, or the garments industry in Bangladesh. So we're going to get really specific about what those material conditions are like and how they're affecting the gender dimensions of injustice and what all that means in terms of work with men and boys. So what we're discussing today is the force fields of power within which we're working, the forces which we're up against. Because when we name the facts around material conditions and globalization, what we need to get to are the forces behind those facts. And I think what we're discussing here is not a context for our work or a background for our work, but it's the terrain of our struggle. Right? It's the grounds on which we're working. And I think this notion of struggle is something we need to keep coming back to and think and talk about what it means to be in a struggle, because to be gender transformative in the way that we're seeking to be is a struggle against the forces that are against gender transformation. So what does it mean to be in that struggle will be a theme running throughout today. And part of that struggle, I think, is thinking about the structural and the individual as not two separate things. Structural over here, individual over here, structural change over here, individual change over here, but thinking about the ways that they are interrelated. Structural conditions get expressed and reinforced in individual lives, and it's individuals coming together to struggle to change those structural conditions that can also produce profound changes in people's personal lives as well. So I think it's really important as we go through the morning that we're thinking about the ways in which the structural and the individual are so closely related together. The other thing I want to say is, before we get into the speakers, is we've already heard quite a lot about what does it mean to be working on empowerment, and I think we need to complicate and challenge the way we think about and work on empowerment issues as we go into this conversation, and not treat empowerment as only an individual thing, and think about empowerment collectively, because when we think about struggle, we're also talking about collective struggle. And I think what that means also is that as we get into the conversation, there's going to be a conversation about strategies, the ways in which we're trying to work, but also the organizational forms that that work takes. Organizational forms, processes, and spaces. Because I think how we are coming together to do this work is a key part of the conversation that we need to have across these different material conditions that we're confronting. So I think with that, I will open up the floor to the first speaker, and I'll invite Nivati to come forwards and share with us her thoughts. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm extremely privileged to be standing before you here today. I was asked to introduce myself, so I will only briefly say that I teach at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and I consider myself to be part of the larger body of students and teachers who think of universities as spaces of unlearning, not learning. So I hope to be part of that, and I'm very privileged to be part of that kind of wider community. In my presentation today, which for some reason that scary-looking timer has not started, so I shouldn't have reminded people about that. But in my brief presentation today, I was going to talk about the ways in which I think different kinds of masculinities have been produced, reshaped, reproduced at different ends of the economic spectrum because of the process of corporate globalization. And I will qualify globalization with corporate globalization because I'm not going to be talking about another kind of globalization, which is this space. Because we are also, of course, part of globalization processes, peace movements, feminist movements across borders. We are not opposed to globalization. We are opposed to corporate globalization. Corporate globalization in India has had two kinds of effects: large-scale dispossession, as well as access to new worlds of desire and consumption. The image that for me captures this disjuncture most starkly is what was reported about a particular gang rape case in Bombay, which came to be called the Shakti Mills rape case, in which a young photojournalist who was actually photographing those abandoned mills as part of her work in broad daylight was raped by 5 men aged 19 to 28. One of them a juvenile, who forced her, even as they were raping her, to watch pornography on their mobile phones. 3 of them had been involved in an earlier gang rape in the same area. These rapists, they've all been arrested, convicted, were all utterly marginal in the new economy of India, with the tremendous transformations that have taken place within the last 10 years, let's say 10 to 12 years. So one of them was the juvenile, that is, sold vegetables with his grandmother for a living. One was an orphan who slept on a footpath. One did odd jobs. And 2 had prior convictions for petty crime. But they possessed mobile phones, and they had access to internet pornography. The women they raped were employed in white-collar professions, a journalist, a call center employee, both of whom eventually testified against the rapists, who were all convicted. The first process of dispossession reflects the abyss of incomprehension on the part of the Indian elites towards rural and tribal communities. Ripping these out from lands they have occupied for generations, or ripping them out from economies in which, even though they didn't possess land, they worked on the margins of those landed communities, ripping them out and transplanting them overnight into an alien setting, which is called rehabilitation, which is the best they can expect. Often they're not rehabilitated. This is understood as rehabilitation and indeed liberation from their backward ways of life. Even when their lands are compensated for by cash, the more fundamental question is whether cash adequately compensates for land. The sudden access to large amounts of cash is something that requires a particular training in market behavior to deal with advantageously. Study after study of dislocated communities conducted by independent groups have found that even in the case of settled urban populations, for example, when industries offer workers cash packages in sunset schemes, immediate access to cash leads to dissipation in things like medical expenses, marriages, and so on. The particular cultural sensibility required to make the most of cash is even more starkly lacking among most of the communities that get displaced, more than half of which comprise tribal populations, and most of whom have had limited interaction or familiarity with the market. Thus, an overwhelming sense of depression and bewilderment is what was... Is it possible to have a light above this podium? So an overwhelming sense of depression and bewilderment is what was encountered by a democratic rights group, PUDR, that visited the resettlement site of tribal people displaced by an alumina mining company in Orissa in 2005. Inadequate drinking water, since most of the hand pumps installed were not working. And of course, having lost their lands and means of livelihood, their access to... This is really very difficult. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stand like this. Since most of the pumps installed were not in working order, having lost their lands and means of livelihood, their access to forest produce, and land for grazing cattle, they were at a loss. The cash they had been given seemed to have been blown away, either in legitimate expenses or in many cases in alcoholism. With no prospect of jobs in the company that had displaced them, for most of them, they were faced with the end of the road. They had nowhere else to go. We can be sure that the vast majority of those ripped out from forests and the land, most of course had no land in the first place, will end up as debris in urban slums, periodically flushed out from the city, only to come trickling back again, to build its roads and flyovers, to scurry across its underbelly, performing the myriad tasks that keep the city alive, and to remind us that at every single stage of the long and dark history of development, alternatives were always available. They were simply not chosen. The first process of dispossession produces the rapid escalation of stark inequality both between rural and urban spaces as well as within urban spaces in India. The glittering malls, hotels, and other spaces of conspicuous consumption, most of which have actually dispossessed communities that were living there. This is a densely populated country. There is no space on which you can just build a mall, unless you're destroying either an ecologically fragile region or uprooting communities, old urban villages, both of which have actually taken place. The arrogance and blindness, the spaces of conspicuous consumption visible to, but brutally inaccessible for hundreds of thousands of dispossessed migrants that throng the city. The arrogance and blindness of India's consuming classes towards the poor and the violence that they themselves routinely practice on those who work for them can only exacerbate the situation, because many of these people live in slums and they work in our homes as domestic servants. The National Commission for Women receives complaints, 8 cases of murder of household help every day from all over the country. The big city in India is becoming a very violent, masculinized space, and this development runs parallel to another process, the second process that I mentioned, the access to new worlds of consumption and desire. The growing assertiveness of young women, not only elite women, not only upper-class women, but lower middle class and working classes as well, who occupy public spaces with confidence, travel late at night for employment or fun, and enjoy the freedom that the city's anonymity gives them. At the other end of the economic spectrum is the threatened masculinity of traditional patriarchal elites and of the new consuming middle classes, the young upper caste men of urban villages from traditional cultures with cash to burn, often because they have sold their lands for these kinds of industrial projects, who drive the SUVs that you see recklessly being driven around the city, and who feel entitled to the phantasmagoric images of consumption they see on television screens and on the internet. The frustration of their desires often draws them into right-wing mobilizations, such as the violent attacks on women in pubs, on couples kissing in public, on, of course, transgender community, the attacks on intercaste and interreligious love affairs. Traditional anxieties about protecting the purity of caste and religious identity come together with modern right-wing anxieties about numbers in a modern polity. Are Hindus going to become a minority because Hindu women are increasingly marrying non-Hindus, especially Muslim men? This anxiety about numbers is a very modern anxiety. How does this switch on? Oh, it's on. Okay. So the traditional anxieties about preserving lineage and descent tie in with modern anxieties about numbers, which are a very specific identity, that is a specific kind of anxiety of political parties in a modern democracy which aims to run as a majoritarian democracy. So this coming together of these two anxieties are also, I think, need to be tied in with a third thing, which is something that is not sufficiently recognized by the Indian mainstream, which is the deep-rooted violence of Hindu society. We hear so much, and you will all have heard so much about the non-violent culture of India, and the non-violence that Gandhi attempted to produce through the through the anti-imperialist struggle was civil disobedience. It was not non-violence in a broader sense, although he himself philosophically adhered to non-violence in a broader sense. All we're really talking about but that was just one strand of the movement. There were many other strands of the anti-imperialist struggle. But the point really is that Hindu society is violent at its core. And this violence of Hindu society is something that we do have to recognize, and it contributes to the violent masculinization. And of course, to this audience, I don't have to say that doesn't mean people assigned gender male at birth. The masculinization of not just the countryside and urban spaces, but private spaces. Routine, ritualized forms of violence are practiced on, for example, Dalits. And the Dalits are the fifth caste, the outcasts. So the standard account, in the few days that you're here, take a look at the newspapers. There will be accounts of parading of Dalit women naked, forcing Dalits to eat excreta, chopping up Dalit men into several pieces for stepping out of line. And the stepping out of line could be refusing to work for no wages. It could be for daring to ride a mare in a wedding ceremony. It could be for daring to fall in love with a so-called upper caste woman. So you have very routinized forms of violence against Dalit bodies, men and women, that are routinely carried out. And you find similar routinized forms of violence against Muslims in communal violence. Gujarat 2002 saw some more particularly hideous incidents. There is nothing traditional about this violence. It is produced in the modern laboratories of majoritarian politics and the desire to control state power. At the same time, we need to consider scholarship on what one could call other masculinities. So there is some very interesting work on South Asian masculinities. I'm thinking of Radhika Chopra, for example, which she terms as supportive, as opposed to that of the autonomous, disconnected masculinity familiar from Western literature. The patriarchal privilege of South Asian men is defined within a network of responsibilities they are expected to fulfill towards their sisters, younger brothers, and parents. Thus, their control and power over women and younger men is mediated by a sense of responsibility towards them that can often be prioritized over their own individual desires and ambitions. Radhika has also pointed out how the institution of domestic servants in South Asia compromises the masculinity of the male domestic servant within the Indian household vis-à-vis his female employer. This subordinate masculinity of male domestic servants can be perceived sometimes as irrelevant or non-existent for the woman of the household, sometimes as overwhelming and dangerous. You might have noticed some big hoardings which say that you should watch out for the driver, from police, Delhi police hoardings, which tell the Indian middle classes to look out for the driver, the nanny, the domestic servant, who all bring in the danger and the hazard of the outside violence into your pure domestic space. In an interesting debate, a scholar called S. Anandi and others had suggested in their study of a Tamil village that competing performances of masculinity by Dalit and upper caste men in the context of rapid socio-economic transformations in the early 21st century place a disproportionate burden on women, both Dalit and non-Dalit. The empowerment of male Dalit youth due to opening up of non-agricultural avenues of income, the authors argued, is marked by hypermasculinity, which is most often asserted against women, their own as well as the other, those of the other. Now, none of these authors were Dalit, and this is important to note, because in a critical response, they're feminists who were not Dalit, And in a critical response, a Dalit male scholar argued that the study and the use of what he called the imported category of masculinity, quote, reinforces hegemonic stereotypes of the newly empowered, aggressive, macho, heterosexual male who can only ever be a violator of the female self, thus posing men and women as groups in perpetual contradiction to each other. His critique suggested that Dalit men and women had shared interests in opposition to non-Dalit men and women. He characterized the study as a manifestation of discomfort with growing Dalit assertion by Brahmin as well as non-Brahmin feminists. Now, I'm not going to take a stand on this debate. I'm simply pointing out to you the fact that the processes that produce violent masculinities are internally differentiated. We need to address a wide range of issues, from the kind of blind corporate globalization that is unjust, inequitable, and ecologically unsustainable, to the ways in which caste and other identities inflect maleness in order to think meaningfully about both masculinity and violence. It is from the disjuncture produced by these different structures and the way in these different structures destabilize one another that alternative ways of being men, women, and indeed of challenging the very idea of gender itself are produced. Thank you.